This past month, truly in 30, 40, 50 years, they'll be talking about what happened in February, March 2025, and what that means for the global order for the next generation going forward. So quite literally, minute by minute, as we're sitting here in the middle of it, right, this is really the heart of the next turn of the international order that we're moving into. So very, very complicated times. I'll try to cover things in about 20, 30 minutes about where things are going. But to begin with, yes, of course. I mean, unless you're entirely blind, there are a lot of reasons to be quite concerned based upon what we've seen, particularly coming out of Washington, D.C. Lately, in terms of the pressure in particular on Ukraine. I'm very happy actually to be doing this presentation today instead of, say, like Tuesday, when things were even more pessimistic. So very, very fortuitous timing for this event. It wasn't just 2 or 3 days ago, because we also have reasons to, in fact, stay optimistic. And truly, since Trump's election, if you've been reading our reports, you've been at our last event, we have been continually saying we remain cautiously optimistic. And that's the way we still feel today. That's the way we felt even on Tuesday after everything going on. The structural drivers still remain relatively positive for Ukraine's future. So cautiously optimistic, that'll be the word I will continue to say. The talks are going to fail, and then what does Trump do is the point. We thought in the past maybe we had a few weeks, maybe several months, but now the decisions look rather imminent. Like literally in days, weeks, he'll have to make a decision. Which side does he sort of come down on? Okay? Positively, though, investor moods from talking to companies over the winter were actually much better than initially expected. And of course, there's a lot of concern the last few weeks. But if you look at the general drivers, consumer spending still remains relatively resilient. Inflation's quite high. Interest rates went back up. There's more depreciation of the hryvnia, but businesses are still seeing increased demand, increased sales orders, and that's both B2B and B2C companies that we talk to every day. So considering everything, still relatively positive. Okay, so what has basically happened? We really should start back at about 1945, because we have truly closed one era in the international order that started after World War II and abruptly ended actually February of 2022, but it seems like the United States and Western Europe found out that that order just collapsed in the last month, okay? So a little bit late to the game. The problem is Russia and China and most of the rest of the world, they did see that collapse already, and they've been preparing and excited about that future. So now what we're seeing, these rapid changes, is really just the West finally understanding that the last 3 years is now sort of condensed into 1 month of massive changes. I have these 3 gentlemen here because that's the old order, right? Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin at Yalta, which set up that previous international system. Trump is now, unfortunately, leading the charge. He's the one, whether consciously or not, he is the one who is now setting the rules, the foundation of this new burgeoning order, which of course is concerning in itself. And unfortunately, he, like Putin, most definitely dreams of dictating the new rules of the world in the same way that Stalin, Roosevelt, Churchill did back in 1945, which is quite concerning, particularly because they want to add Xi Jinping to this mix as well, clearly, and Xi Jinping is likewise dreaming of being one of these gentlemen who will be ushering in this new era. I put this quote here because this was the defining principle of specifically US policy, right, towards the Soviet Union at the time, written by George Kennan, right, the author of the long telegram, the father of containment. The policy that he proposed, which was relatively successful for the Western world, for the United States specifically, was long-term, patient, firm, and vigilant containment of the Soviet Union at the time, and now it's applicable to Russia at the time. The central problem here is that adjectives like long-term, patient, firm, vigilant are not necessarily adjectives you would ascribe to Donald Trump, which is quite concerning. So that's the first point of concern. I have more optimism coming, but that's the first, that's the first point. It's been a long way between the Oval Office, what happened a couple weeks ago, and what happened in Jeddah. So very positively, what kind of got lost in the mix here is that actually Trump more or less backed down to Zelensky who stood up to Trump on 3 separate occasions, in fact. So that's actually quite positive. Why would Trump do that? Trump called him a dictator. Zelensky said, I'll resign then tomorrow, and then Trump retracted, right? He pushed the mineral rights deal, kept pushing, demanded an apology from Zelensky. Zelensky refused to apologize, said it was regrettable. Trump took it. The aid came back, okay? So this has kind of worked to date, right? Let's wait 2 hours and we'll see if things change. But to date, this has kind of worked thus far in Zelensky's favor. And then critically, we've pushed the burden onto Russia, finally, okay? Why did Trump do this? Okay, there's a lot of evidence from the US side, from the Ukrainian side that we're hearing. Trump obviously needs to placate, right? He needs to play to his domestic base that he's getting something for America. He's extorting Ukraine out of its mineral riches to pay back the US for its support. But also at a personal level, Trump is an extraordinarily vain, right, egocentric human. And we know from his first term, he tried to give himself the Nobel Prize for the work in North Korea. He very consciously wants the Nobel Prize. So that's one of the underlying motivations of why Trump has continued and has come back and is trying to still try to make peace. As shallow as that may be, that is one of the major drivers, again, of ushering in this new era that we're moving into. On Zelensky's side, no surprise here, of course, needs the military support. We'll get into that. How desperately does Ukraine actually need US military support anymore? It's not as critical as before, but, and then more critically, making progress towards those security guarantees. So obviously, he's incentivized, no big surprise there. The other thing missed in what happened in the Oval Office and then moving towards Jeddah was that Europe, for the first time in 80 years, is now actually taking care of its own security. And by doing that, has actually got themselves a place at the negotiating table. After Trump went over Zelensky's head, went over all of Europe's head, and went straight to Putin. Now, for any settlement, they have to involve Europe, which is quite positive for Europe, and Europe earned it. But we need to see more progress, of course, from Europe. And now, as Marco Rubio said, the ball is in Russia's court, so watch now. Okay, things are moving very rapidly, and we saw even yesterday, right, with Putin's response to Trump's offer. The ball is in Russia's court, so how does Russia view these things? Nothing has changed. I think most people in the room understand. Nothing has fundamentally changed. Russia seeks dominion, seeks control, seeks authority over Ukraine. That doesn't change. So the only calculus here is, does a ceasefire actually work towards Putin's goal of getting future control over Ukraine? The thing is, within Trump's administration, it seems like most of the members of his administration, and by the way, most US public, understand this point. It's just unclear if Trump does, and unfortunately, Musk has his ear, and Musk is a fan of Kremlin propaganda. So that's the big concern here. What could Russia do in response to the burden finally being on them with this ceasefire proposal? You could agree immediately, and then, of course, violate it, try to blame it on Ukraine. You could reject it and just hope Trump wouldn't throw sanctions on you. Or you can do what every Soviet leader did throughout the Cold War, and Putin has done throughout his career, is delay, defect, divert attention, say yes, kind of, sort of, maybe, but, and then start bringing up your actual real demands, which is a rejection, which is a no in reality. But now we're going to see how this plays out. And if you remember from the last event, I had mentioned Putin's strategy is very likely to stall and delay and just to see if he can outlast Trump. And that's, at least for 24 hours, that's at least where we're at currently. It doesn't do anything, the ceasefire talks, to actually move towards the long-term problem of Ukraine's security guarantees and the continued military support to sustain the fight, of course, against Russia and defend Ukraine's long-term sovereignty. Ukraine, of course, needs the security guarantees. US won't give them, at least where we are today, and Russia won't allow them. So now we need to buy time as Europe develops them. And very positively, these last 2 weeks were absolutely critical in European history. This could have gone in different ways, but Europe is genuinely scared, fortunately. And so now they're taking their security serious for literally the first time in 80 years. So moving in a better direction. Trump's policy, though, can we still say peace through strength? Okay, this is what they were saying in November, December, January, and the first half of February. They were all trying to quote Reagan. They all wanted to be the next Ronald Reagan. Peace through strength, peace through strength, peace through strength. And the rhetoric was pretty good, and then they started putting extreme pressure on Zelensky. Waltz had said, enforcing sanctions, unleashing American oil and gas, go after, essentially, Russia's oil export revenues, and then we can defeat them. And that was the mantra, of course, in the 80s of Reagan. Just outspend them. We have a stronger economy, and we can then defeat the Soviet Union. Secretary of State Rubio, this is maybe the most important point, understanding that Russia won't stop. We need a durable, lasting peace. J.D. Vance said something very similar as well. Not very pro-Ukrainian individual, but he's also made comments about durable peace to ensure, as J.D. Vance said, Ukraine's long-term independence and sovereignty. And then Bessent, who has said, even just yesterday, said we would use sanctions to push on Russia, bring them to the table. So they actually have shown that they have an understanding of this. Trump, we're not sure entirely, but his team seems to. And then also what's relatively positive is that we still can count on Donald Trump's personality. On the one hand, extraordinarily vain individual, needs to look like a winner, can't be seen as a loser, can't be seen as weak internationally. It would be hard to hide the humiliation. But, by the way, this is what the Kremlin is thinking immediately right now, all day. How can we make Trump lose without Trump knowing he lost? Okay? Hopefully they can't achieve that, but that is surely what they're going after. Now the concerns, of course, is Trump's personality. Not necessarily a patient man, not ready to likely endure the negotiations, the long-term vigilant containment that's necessary of the Kremlin. Versus Putin's team, when you think about the experience of his team, all over 70 years old, extremely experienced, hardened negotiations, talks with the most high-profile leaders around the world for decades. KGB experience from decades ago. Obviously, when you compare Trump's team versus Putin's team, it's a little bit discouraging. Trump's team clearly has no plan, no alignment internally, contradicting each other, backtracking comments of themselves, backtracking comments of other administrators, frankly, chaotic, dysfunctional, even embarrassing. And then the most worrying part is that we don't see a principled stance from the President of the United States to uphold the very Western order that the United States initiated and has managed and benefited from for the last 80 years. So this is, of course, the most concerning point, particularly as the same individual is saying we should be annexing Greenland and Canada and Panama, et cetera, which is essentially Putin's Crimea and Donbass. Also to look out for, which I think people don't quite appreciate outside of the United States, is the amount of domestic turmoil and chaos that we're seeing, which is going to continue in Washington, D.C., in going after all of these departments. Okay, I don't think anybody likes bureaucrats. I know Ukrainians don't like bureaucrats. Americans don't like bureaucrats either. But bureaucrats are necessary in order to administer and implement policy, whether you like it or not. And there's nowhere where it's more critical than in Washington, D.C., in the Pentagon, with its $800 billion budget and the massive amount of workers that you need their compliance in order to implement policy. This itself, as this goes on for the coming months, this could impact America's ability to implement any foreign policy anywhere in the world. So this could be a limitation as well. Cutting through all the noise, though, what do we actually know about Trump's policy? What are the core components? Okay, he's already revealed the first two because these were the concessions they willfully made to Russia. So much for art of the deal. Just handing Russia a few concessions, right, of land and then no NATO membership. Okay. We also know, though, that they have said repeatedly that Russia needs to concede these things. They haven't pushed this on Russia yet, but for the long-term future, they have talked about continuing to arm Ukraine and security guarantees for Ukraine, but not from Washington, D.C., right? European troops in the country. These things, of course, are non-starters for Putin. So this is what we're going to see, I mean, literally today, tomorrow, in the coming week, these issues being raised, and then now the ball's back in Trump's court. How does Trump respond? So where are we with talks? Talks just began in February. We saw the extreme pressure on Zelensky in Ukraine here. Unfortunately, we've now moved past that positively. Russia has engaged, as expected, insincerely and delaying. Trump is going to get frustrated, and they're relying on Trump's frustration in order to get more benefits from diplomacy, for the Kremlin to get more benefits, and then Trump makes a decision. Abandon Ukraine or provide more support. Or, by the way, could just sort of stay neutral as well. So what is Trump trying to do, though? One, he wants a ceasefire. So this is a problem because he wants a ceasefire and then start talking, and Putin wants the opposite. Putin wants to keep killing people while you're still talking. which shouldn't be a surprise because that's what Putin did with Minsk 1 and 2. He had no interest in negotiations. He wanted to keep killing people and talk while you're killing people. So this is already an initial problem, of course. So we'll see how Trump responds. But Trump has already indicated, and Putin has received this, that they want to do some sort of bigger, grander deal, okay? And this is what we can be looking out for here in the coming weeks. Can a Kissingerian, right, 1971, 72, Russia-China split, can the Trump team manufacture this? Okay, is a Sino-Russian split possible? Let me get out of the way. So this is Nixon meeting Mao when they did this successfully, Nixon and Kissinger in 1972. This is almost certainly not possible currently. And again, then you have to think, if this is impossible, how does Trump respond after that? Okay, the reasons it's not possible is because in reality, the US actually didn't drive them apart in the late 1960s, early 70s. In 1969, the Soviet Union had nearly 600,000 soldiers on the border of communist China. They had an artillery duel in March of 1969. Okay? China was waiting to be taken in reality, and it still took enormous diplomatic acumen and adroitness in order to pull this off by some of the best historically politicians in the United States history. Mao Zedong had even said at the time, Soviet imperialism is worse than US capitalist imperialism. He identified the Soviet Union as more of an enemy than the United States itself. This is not the current conditions today, of course, in terms of Russia and China's relationship. They're satisfied partners to a degree. They both independently, Xi Jinping and Putin, for the last decade, have said that they are in a civilizational battle against the West. Right? The focal point of their shared animosity is the United States itself. So this is extremely far apart from where we were in 1971, 72. Also, Trump can't fundamentally give Putin what he's trying to get. Ukrainians won't let him, for one, and Europeans now, thankfully, in the last 2 weeks, also won't let him get what he wants. So Trump can give him great power status by meeting him. Maybe in the coming week they meet personally. He can maybe take off some sanctions here and there, even though Europe won't. And by the way, you need Congress's compliance, which will be a problem. But he can't give Putin fundamentally what he's looking for. So another reason to believe this likely can't happen in the way Trump is envisioning. So all of that said, curious to hear, you've been watching the news, of course, what everybody in the room thinks. Please, you can scan the QR code, take the poll here. What do you think Trump will do? I should check my phone and see if we already have an answer. You know, an update from FT. Wow. Okay. Very good. 60%, still quite positive. Anybody have a comment? Why are you still positive after, were you not reading the news the past week? I mean, he cut off aid. Until 2 days ago, we didn't have the aid at all. It's not positive enough, of course, but it could be much worse. Sorry?
There should be fourth option.
Doesn't? Very good. I'll get to that. Did you see the presentation already? Got ahead. What's interesting, though, very good, is that when we did the poll last event, so in mid-December, there's actually similar results. So I think that's one lesson. It's one lesson I've told myself so I can sleep at night, and Andrew and I talk about just, it's a roller coaster with Trump, but as you can see, actually, sentiment is similar compared to December. So it's a good lesson for everybody, maybe. Coming to your point, will Europe step up and fill the gap? I'll share my view in a minute, but if you don't mind answering that and again. Ooh. I'm getting nervous watching it, yeah. Okay, good. All right. Well, 2/3 of the room. This is quite optimistic. Everybody, when you're walking in the room today, everybody's got their head down and saying, God, it's such a difficult week. It's actually looking okay. Okay, so 2/3 believe Europe can fill the gap. I agree. I think Europe can fill the gap, especially because they have to fill the gap. Europe has to take its security seriously. And there are ways to do this. It'll take time, of course, but Europe, again, for the first time in 80 years, is getting the message. Okay? On the one hand, we haven't seen Europe be serious about its security in 80 years. But on the other hand, we haven't seen Europe be serious about its security in 80 years. And we know what Germans did last time when they were serious about their security. So now if they're determined in the right way, okay, this could be positive for Ukraine. It's a matter of political will, not finances at the end of the day. This can be done, right? Far larger resources than Russia. They've already talked about this 800 billion euro. I wouldn't make too much of this quite yet, this spending plan. It's more, they're allowed to spend 800 billion euros. This is not necessarily in reality, in action. Much more serious about taking Russia's FX reserves. End of Germany's debt break, which might be the most important thing here. Germany is the political, economic, and financial engine of Europe. If that is moving in the right direction, it drags the rest of Europe with it. This is quite, Deutsche Bank, one of the lead economists at Deutsche Bank said, this is a mindset shift for Germany, the biggest mindset shift since 1945. Okay? Things have fundamentally changed. Okay? Germany's getting the message. Don't forget also Turkey, the most robust, strongest military in all of Europe, alongside Ukraine, but a NATO member, and very anti-Russian. Erdogan, remember, shot down in 2015, shot down a jet that entered Turkish airspace for about 20 seconds. Good for him. Bring that resolve to Ukraine. And then Norway's sovereign wealth fund. A lot of people may not know, but Norway has by far the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, approaching $1.8 trillion. And there is serious talk about tapping that. And critically, the Minister of Finance is the former head of NATO, so the Minister of Finance of Norway. So a defense-oriented minister may help tap those assets. And they're getting much more serious about that. So then you have the money, and then, ideally, turn to the United States. This is in a situation where the United States, at least, is just neutral. Okay, just don't side with Russia, right? You can get a lot of these gaps, a lot of these areas that Europe can't provide and Ukraine can't produce for itself. Turn to Donald Trump, Starmer, Macron, Maloney, fly to Washington, D.C., say it's the deal of the century. Donald Trump, here's $100 billion. We want to buy X, Y, and Z. How does Donald Trump, the transactional businessman president, in front of the world say, no, I'm not going to sell Europe these weapons? Particularly when it would be popular to sell those in the United States, to sell those weapons, contribute to the US economy, and contribute to Ukraine. So it put him into a difficult position. But then the problem would become, which is unfortunate, very unlikely, but in the realm of possibilities, would Trump in fact side with Russia and not help Europe and Ukraine? I think it's very unlikely, but unfortunately you do have to entertain this possibility. So all of that said, it's worth noting, again, this is a sea change in the world. Just kind of go on a lighter note, there was a great quote recently by a German journalist who said, as a German, I want to get this straight. Build up a huge army, march through Poland and Ukraine, and fight the Russians. Just writing it down so there's no misunderstandings in the future. Like I said, we want Germany determined, but in the right way this time. And we might be getting it, hopefully. Similarly, another strange thing on the other side of the Atlantic, the US. Since when did the US and Republicans, Republican president, House, Senate, destroying the military-industrial complex? Finland, Portugal, just in the last day, turned down purchases of F-35s. This devastates the business model for the military-industrial complex in the United States. The United States won't send soldiers to fight abroad, won't fight the Russians themselves. Republicans aren't anti-Russian. The world is obviously changing. You may have seen this US comedian, Jon Stewart, the famous line, "War is God's way of teaching Americans geography." So things have changed dramatically where the US actually is not so aggressive abroad. So that said, I won't go into every detail here. You've seen these scenarios. I will note, compared to last time, these scenarios haven't changed much at all, actually. Again, just to keep the bigger perspective. Ignore the roller coaster every day of Donald Trump and everything going on. The fundamentals remain relatively consistent. We've been saying since April 2022, scenario 2, land for peace deal. Now those security guarantees that support, fundamentally not coming from the United States as much, but more from Europe over time. This is still doable. Unfortunately, the Russian victory, for the reasons mentioned, becomes a little bit more likely, but still quite unlikely. And then this has been risen a bit, the frozen conflict, scenario 3. Because Trump has officially said, after the Oval Office fight with Zelensky, he came out onto the lawn and said, look, we can just cut this off entirely and let Ukraine and Russia fight this out. Which means he may not end the war, and we could see a frozen conflict for the long term. Relatively encouraging, I'd say. So what should we be watching for going forward? I'll ask the panelists this as well. Be curious to hear what they think are the fundamentals to be paying attention to in the hours and days and weeks ahead. Ceasefire deal, obviously. Russia's reaction, Trump's reaction, what will he do? That's most clear. We need to see continued development of security guarantees out of the EU. The money, the equipment, and in particular, Sky Shield. Particularly if US aid does end in the coming months, that long-range air defense will be necessary. Mobilization here and mobilization in Russia. That itself could change the peace process from Washington, D.C.'s point of view. So as a political component, but then it also shows the duration of the war, how long it would likely last, and naturally impact on investors here in the country with more pressure on the labor force. And then the US economy. Something people aren't paying enough attention to is that nobody thought that it would be the US economy that would be dragging down oil prices this year. Now there's really no saving grace for oil prices, for all commodities, but for oil prices in particular this year. We've been praying for oil prices to come down, so you could, of course, kill the Russian war machine. It might be coming out of the United States to do that in the coming months, ironically enough. If Trump continues with all these tariffs, with everything that's going, this momentum continues, these policies continue, the US economy could slow down to such a place. Betting markets a couple days ago, 40% chance of a recession for the United States this year. Oil's already under $70 a barrel. Russia currently, without additional sanctions pressure, Russia currently sells at about $10 less than that. Russia needs, so at about 60, Russia needs for the budget $70 a barrel. If we see oil prices approaching 60, Russia selling at 50 or below, that becomes problematic for Russia. So watch out for that, and that could come out of the United States, strangely enough. Okay, so all that said, market dynamics, very, very briefly. Typically, for those of you who have not been to events in the past, we'd go into much more depth on the macroeconomic forecasts, and then linking it to what it means for business, and to operations and execution, and what businesses are feeling and thinking and saying, right? We're going to focus more on geopolitics today, so I won't go into too much depth, but looking at the forecasts are still relatively stable. Forecasts the last several months had come down for 2025, but now they're relatively stable, around 3.5% to 4% growth. Inflation, though, is much higher than expected. Interest rates had to go up again, which was not anticipated a few months ago. And then the hryvnia also. We're seeing more depreciation and sooner. We're expecting more depreciation of the hryvnia in the second half of the year, but now we're seeing more hryvnia depreciation probably in the next few weeks, probably likely starting in April. The central bank has been intervening much more to support the currency. So more pressure there. So when you're, sorry, let me bring this up here. When you're considering, in terms of the impact on your business, factor that in with the import pressure coming, the price competitiveness of your products, which there could be an impact relatively soon. Business sentiment did pick up in February, which is quite encouraging, mostly for seasonal reasons, but there's a lot of positivity there. And then inflation over 13%, which again, 6 months ago, 9 months ago, this is well beyond initial forecasts and expectations. So this is likely, unfortunately, to continue through the first half of this year. All right.
All right.
Any questions before we move on? There must be questions. Or disagree? No.
Questions?
You have an easy one, Edvin? If it's an easy one, please. You're welcome to ask. Okay.
The microphone?
Please introduce yourself as well, Edvin.
So my name is Edwin Cornelius, Pravda Advisory, so this is my private company. I love, Mark, so that you're so optimistic. May I ask you one very practical, so very, very straightforward question? How far Kyiv is from the closest front line, kilometers?
Kilometers?
Yeah.
How many kilometers is that?
200, 300,
No.
500,
Oh,
600?
it's 5.
From Kyiv. 150. Okay, so then it's really close. So I'm from Riga. I live in Riga, so like for 3 years now. So we have till Russia 250 kilometers. We have roughly 10,000 soldiers together with NATO and about 40,000 Russian citizens. So like in form of residence, in form of double citizenship. And of course, I would like so that you are correct, so that Europe stands up, so invests in military, don't pay more for Russian energy, so than for aiding Ukraine. I hope so much. But my question is really easy one. So I tried to count how many times you put Putin, so like on your presentation. I deliberately made a post this morning, so like why it's not Putin's war. So like, and then you haven't mentioned at all the Kremlin, a bit Russia, no Russians. How do you see that? So do you really personally, so like on the personal psychological level, believe so that it's Putin's war? And if it's Putin gone or dead tomorrow, so things will eventually change?
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
No, absolutely not. It's Russia's war. They're the ones signing up. They're the ones seeing the payout and willing to sign the contract and join. And this is deep in Russian culture. Putin is just the manifestation of 500 years of Russian imperialistic culture. It could be nearly anybody, Ivan, you could pull off the street of Kostroma or Volgograd or anywhere and put him in the presidency, groom him, give him enough training, and then out pops this conflict with the West and this imperialistic war with Ukraine, with Moldova, with Georgia, with the rest of the region. So, thanks. Easy question. I like it.
Any other questions?
Another question? Thank you. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Anna Mikulitska. I'm representing a German company, SAP. My question is not directly related to the war, but is very much related to the United States, which now holds in their hands much more than at stake, which probably was before. What do you think are the scenarios of development of Trump and Trump's politics in the near future, 12 to 24 months, next 4 years during his tenure? What's the patience level of the U.S. society? So that they can tolerate, tolerance band,
right.
Let's put it
okay,
like
thanks. Yeah, good question. So, I mean, just practically speaking, in terms of the Constitution and what the United States can do relative to other countries to remove a leader from power, there's really, we have to wait out the 4 years. However, the more hope is that in 2 years, Democrats take over House and Senate because of Trump's policies and the Republicans going along with that. So we have 2 years, not 4 necessarily, but 2 years to limit him. Secondly, there's so much extreme dysfunction in what's going on. And if you look at Trump's first term, the burn rate of his advisors is extremely high. Okay? And that was under more normal conditions. This is extreme what he's doing currently compared to even his first term. So expect the burn rate. I mean, seeing people like Rubio and Waltz in power in 6 months, don't necessarily think that these guys would still be in power. Elon Musk, I think this is becoming clear to most people that how would they last the year with each other. The problem is you are going to have, let's say, 35% of Americans supporting Trump, quite literally no matter what he does. Okay? A thing to watch out for, though, in the coming months is Trump is going to commit, it looks like he's set to commit the most cardinal sin in U.S. modern political history because they're going to go after Medicare and Social Security. And not a single Republican or Democrat in the last 50 years has had the guts to touch either of those. And Trump's core voter base are people over 65, right, who say they hate the government, but they love the nationalized healthcare system that they get, and they love the Social Security check they get every month, but nobody else can get those if you're under 65, of course. When he starts going after that, and you start impacting that, that's his core voter base, then you can start seeing even further deterioration. But of course, it depends, do they actually go after that? Are they actually serious? How does that play out? But that'll become a problem. But you should just keep in your mind, Trump, almost no matter what he does, is going to have 35% of the country supporting him. So, we'll see. Yes, just one quick question, because we do have to move to the panel. A quick question? Really quick.
Question will be quick. Peter Stransky, Arab Global. You haven't mentioned one, and I think very important player, which is China, because our view is actually it's a China which is having a high interest over Ukraine, and Russia is doing to its bidding without knowing actually doing it. And I think China's action, therefore, will have a lot of influence on what will be happening here as well. So it's a bit more open question, but...
sorry, what's the question? What's China's role going to be in this?
Yes, it was more question why you actually were not even taking China into consideration.
Yeah, because I'm focusing a little bit more on the short term here in the next couple of weeks of what develops. But you're absolutely right. I mean, this is one of the fundamentals. And Rubio, for example, calling this a proxy war between the United States and Russia, I don't know who's Russia's proxy in Ukraine. In reality, if it's a proxy war, it's the United States against China and Ukraine's fighting Russia. They're the two proxies. So looking through that prism, then we have to focus on China's role in this. I think China could play an interesting role because, especially as the trade war continues, if Trump wants this valueless, unprincipled, might makes right world, then it makes sense for Europe and China and Canada and Mexico to team up in the trade war against the United States in the coming months. And then you link all this together, then you can start putting pressure on the war here and on Russia and to end the war here if they pressure the United States to that degree. So I think that's just a very, very brief, short answer that China could be involved in that. But China doesn't care about ending the war here unless China can be seen as the peacemaker and as having brought peace to Europe, right? Which Trump wants that Nobel Prize. He doesn't want Xi Jinping to get that. So China's not going to help end this war unless it benefits them, makes them look like a global peacemaker, particularly when the United States for the last 30 years has been the global warmonger. Okay, we need to move on.
We had one more question and we're done.
My name is George. I represent Felix. It's a company that specializes in securities management. My question is about Georgia because I'm from Georgia. A lot of people think that because of what's going on, a lot of small countries will be traded in for a peace within the region. We're part of it. Moldova, Ukraine, and Belarus are part of it. So how do you think things will develop for us, for the small countries?
For Georgia specifically? Or
Georgia, yes.
Well, I think overall, long-term trajectory, we're watching, there's a historical process. And this is why I'm fundamentally so confident in Ukraine's future, because we are watching the collapse of the last European empire. All the other European empires collapsed over the course of the 20th century. The Russian Empire is collapsing in front of our eyes, and this was the sin Putin committed, the last act to destroy the empire, which means we're going to watch here the next 5 to 10 years, liberation then of these peripheral states. You don't have a Russian Empire without Ukraine. So when Russia loses Ukraine, that's going to be beneficial for Moldova, for Georgia, for the Stans, etc.